Okay, before I explain myself, let me explain myself. Back in September, I made a video called I Never Played Psychonauts 1, I Love Psychonauts 2. I really like that idea, that approach to a review, embracing the fact that this is my first experience with a series, especially when that series has been on hiatus for a while, or did something like being added to Game Pass day one, which opens it up for tons of new people to try it. I have a lot of blind spots when it comes to the history of gaming, and rather than act like I know every single series inside and out, I wanted to sometimes, when it applies, be the voice of the newcomer. Because with how accessible gaming has now become, the number of newcomers to legendary series is growing at a rapid rate. When I had this idea in early September with this first video, the next game that popped into my mind was Halo. Halo is one of the biggest, most iconic, most well-recognized gaming franchises of all time, but I never had an Xbox growing up, so I never had access to these games. I was off in PlayStation land. I actually decided that I might play all the Halo games in preparation for Halo Infinite when I got an Xbox in late 2020, but I never carved out the time until late August when I played an hour of Halo 1, and then like a few days later I decided on this video concept and stopped playing it so it was actually authentic. In my head, the title of my Halo video was always, I've never played Halo before, I love Halo Infinite. Not because I was making my mind up before the game came out, that's dumb, but the placeholder word was always love because I was expecting to really like this game. I was rooting for it. I couldn't care less about the console wars, I just want to play good games and keep the landscape of first-party games competitive, and I like seeing things succeed when they deserve it. The game was getting a much needed delay, so it didn't feel like it was being rushed out to match the console launch. First impressions started coming in and they were great. The multiplayer feedback was really positive. I played the multiplayer and really enjoyed it. It didn't hook me for too long, but I enjoyed what I did play of it. And when the campaign came out to some pretty positive reviews, it felt like my title was basically solidified. In my head, I was thinking this is going to be a good game that'll be fun to talk about from a newcomer's perspective. And then, I played it. And I didn't like it. I say this one for setup and understanding of where I came from when approaching this game, but also to make it clear that I'm not just taking a devil's advocate stance in hopes this video blows up or because I'm a PlayStation fan and I want to make fun of Xbox. I genuinely wanted the best for this game, and at the end of the day, I'm glad that so many people enjoyed it and it reignited people's love of Halo. But I also think this game was let off the hook really easy, and I think you start to notice a lot of cracks when you're not a longtime Halo fan, so I guess it's time for me to explain why I kinda hated Halo Infinite. I think we need to start with some stuff that most people, no matter what their background is with this series, can agree on. The open world is, how do I put this? Bad. You know what, that actually wasn't so hard. I don't think this is a universal complaint, but it's one that I've seen the most about this game, and it starts with the visuals. One thing I'll say is that as far as fidelity and performance goes, this game is pretty fantastic. Good performance in a game is kind of like good editing in a movie. A lot of the time, if it's amazing, you don't even notice it. That's kind of the point. You're more likely to notice jarring edits than competent ones, so when I tell you that the topic of performance didn't even pop into my mind until I sat down to write this review, that's a really good thing. I experienced exactly one weird moment where the game looked like it was about to crash, but it actually just stalled for 10 seconds and continued. Other than that, no frame drops that I noticed. I don't even think I noticed any pop-ins while playing, which is pretty impressive. And for context, I was playing this game on an Xbox Series S, and that's where all the footage is from, and I'll be keeping the footage mainly to the first few hours of the game and avoiding spoilers throughout. While the game runs exceptionally well, I don't have the same high praise for the actual look of this open world. I don't want to beat around the bush here. This is hands down one of the most bland, empty, repetitive looking open worlds I've ever seen. The world is just a big rock.
It's about drive, it's about power.
No shit, you stay out of this. The world of Zeta Halo is incredibly dull looking. The color palette is almost exclusively brown, green, and dark blue. It features zero interesting landmarks. It's filled with areas that look exactly the same, and it gives no incentive to explore it outside of speeding up your upgrade process or completing a checklist. From a gameplay perspective, it's even more dull. I realized pretty early on that all of this open world stuff was not worth it, and I decided to mainline the story because the open world activities are just busy work. Although, in fairness, so are a lot of the story missions, but we'll get to that in a second. Outside of the copy and paste objectives, kill a handful of people here to open up a fast travel point, kill a bigger handful of people here to get some upgrade points, kill a really small handful of people here and then shoot this little thing to blow it up, the best the game can come up with in terms of making the world feel dynamic and lived in is by introducing high value targets. You'll be driving over to a new objective, and actually, real quick, just to throw it in there, driving is not fun in this game. It feels floaty and old. It feels like how it felt when I played Halo 1 for an hour, and that game is 2 decades old. Just because you're trying to be authentic to the original Halos does not mean you need to make your vehicles feel like their handling was made 20 years ago. Anyways, you'll be driving to a new objective, and all of a sudden, Walmart Cortana goes, hey, there's a high-value target here, which is basically just a normal enemy with extra health and a slightly more powerful weapon. And either you'll absolutely steamroll them in 5 seconds, or they'll have an ungodly amount of health that you just start pumping a billion bullets into until they die. These high-value hunters, for example, had so much HP that I need to go and find like 18 guns just to have enough ammo to make a dent in their health bars. So I started shooting at them with a vehicle, and it was just a 10-minute fight of me shooting directly forwards and slowly moving out of the way of the same attacks over and over. This isn't fun at all. I clicked with literally 0 of the open world activities. I want to compare this to another game real quick, and it's going to be a bit confusing why I'm doing this at first, but it'll make sense in time. I made a video about Ghost of Tsushima last year where I dubbed it as having perfectly executed unoriginality. Basically what I meant was that Ghost's open world formula was incredibly derivative of its contemporaries. It brought no functional changes aside from an innovative new way for the world to guide you to objectives rather than being given 100 markers all over the place. And yet, despite its unoriginality, which is my biggest problem with the game, it executed those unoriginal ideas in the best way we'd ever seen. The world was absolutely breathtaking, the reasoning for stuff like strongholds or fighting powerful enemies was much more justified and integrated in an interesting way into the story, and the activities that you were doing, while in lots of ways still copied and pasted, felt tailored to the setting of feudal Japan. The fox dens, the hot springs, the haiku spots, the bamboo strikes, the mystic tales, everything. Its reliance on an open world formula was one of its greatest weaknesses, but it was hands down the strongest version of that formula that we'd ever seen. On the other hand, I truly think that Halo Infinite is one of the biggest examples of poorly executed unoriginality. The world has no sense of life, no distinct or interesting look, shoehorned in reasons for objectives, no interesting plays on the formula, nothing. I dare say I found the open world aspect of this game worse than any Ubisoft game I've ever played, because at least those usually have some color or some cool settings, and even when they have annoying sections where you gotta climb up stuff to unlock part of the map, the view is usually kinda cool and you get to jump into a haystack. Halo Infinite has the most lifeless open world I've ever seen, and despite the fact that most people are complaining about this, I don't think it's had enough of an impact on the discourse of this game. I don't like how we keep saying, yeah, the open world is boring, but whatever, it doesn't actually matter. If we want this style of open world to actually improve, we gotta stop brushing this issue off. Another big problem that I had that's adjacent to this, and a lot of people have also brought this up, is the level design. I don't want to harp on this too long because I already wrote way too much about the open world, but my god, I didn't have a single moment, a single millisecond in this game where I thought to myself, wow, that was a cool level or encounter. The closest I got to that was in this room because it had launch pads on both sides so you could pick up explosives and chuck them while you're flying in the sky, and I mean, that's the best encounter. Everything else is a big space with a bunch of enemies and rocks everywhere, or a room with a couple of pillars and 2 floors. And it's to the point that not only does nothing stand out, but so many things look the exact same that they all blend together. When your game is not a Metroidvania and the player is constantly asking themselves, wait, haven't I been here already? That's a problem, especially when no, they have not been here before. I swear they reused the exact same level layouts 10 times each. I wasn't paying hard enough attention to know for sure, but that's what it felt like. Not a single thing stood out to me visually, not a single layout created a more dynamic shootout outside of a couple of boss rooms. Genuinely, I think the most actually unique encounter layout was when this platform was moving forward incredibly slowly and the game threw a few enemies at you to handle as it happened. Something that's been done in a million other games and done much better in each. Here they threw a couple of sentinels at you at a low rate and that's it. This was the most creative you could get. I know this is a bit out of character for me to be ragging on a game like this. Like I've said before, I usually like being positive about games. If I'm not enjoying something, I just stop playing it, or if I think I won't enjoy something, I don't touch it at all. But Halo's interesting because I thought I'd like it, and then when I started not liking it, I probably would have just abandoned it, but I'd already made up my mind about making a video on it, so now I'm here, done the game, and feeling like so much of it wasted my time. The whole game felt like a big, muddled mess to me structurally, and it wound up bugging me a lot more than I realized it did. And with that, I think we need to transition into some issues that I think are not quite as agreed upon, but I've definitely seen some people complain about with this game. I do not like the story of Halo Infinite. But you know what, actually, let's immediately pivot to something a bit more positive and talk about a couple of things that I'm alright with. First off, the performances are pretty solid. I'll get into characters that I like and don't like in a sec, but the main cast at least brought energy and effort to the table. We're not getting Red Dead or Last of Us level acting here, but the actors during the cutscenes do a pretty decent job, although I feel like I have to bring up the fact that outside of the cutscenes, Weapon in particular takes a massive hit in her performance. Her character has a certain layer of robotic energy and humanoid energy to it, and while the balance between the two shifts quite a bit throughout the game, seemingly at random, like one line will be super robotic and the next will be like she's a normal human being, the acting only really takes a big dive when she chimes in about nearby fobs or high value targets, where she starts reminding me of Dinklebot from Vanilla Destiny.
That fob belongs to the Banished. It should belong to us.
Outside of that though, I can't complain too much about the acting. I also like that the game has an audience surrogate character. In fact, it kind of has two, Weapon and the pilot. And these two characters prove to me that as much as this game wants to be of service to longtime Halo fans, it's equally as interested in bringing in a ton of new fans as well. Which is another reason why I stuck with this video after my brain told me to stop playing the game because I wasn't having fun. I felt like I was honestly a major target demographic for this game, so my experience might actually be something somewhat important. The pilot is the normal person in the group. Him and Master Chief represent flight and fight respectively. And this character serves as a way to show us just how heroic Master Chief is to be facing all of this stuff head on with no fear, because if we were there, we'd be pooping in our pantaloonies. Having that contrast is a smart play for a story that puts the main focus on a small group of characters. And similarly, Weapon feels like her purpose is to allow the game to have a character that doesn't fully know what's going on, doesn't know the history of this world, and needs certain past events explained to her, which is obviously helpful for somebody who doesn't actually know much about the lore of this world. The ideas behind both of these characters were good ideas. Now for the bad stuff. I don't think anything past the core ideas of these characters was done very well. The introduction of the pilot is short and sweet. I like this intro a lot and it makes us immediately sympathetic to him. But the issue that we run into is that until the last leg of the game, homie barely shows up after this other than to give small snippets of dialogue that have little substance. The pilot's very simple, basic, short arc is all delivered closer to the end, which I won't get into since that's spoiler territory. Other than that, all he does is stay stagnant and complain whenever he shows up, which is understandable, sure, but that doesn't make for a good character. His development barely gets past the conceptual stage, and for him to be the heart of this story, it's kinda crazy how little he's utilized. One of the only moments where I sat there and said, that was a good scene, involved a little heart-to-heart between the three main characters. It wasn't an astounding scene, but it was solid, and if they put more focus on this dynamic, I think I would've liked the story a lot more. But as it stands, it felt like they couldn't decide if they wanted to tell a story about a big, dangerous, life-ending enemy faction, or if they wanted to tell a more personal story between three core characters. And somebody probably should have told them that, hey, you can combine those together, cause instead we get two half-baked, disjointed intentions with the narrative. I'm also not the biggest fan of Weapon. Her super intelligent AI who's also naive and bubbly shtick got really old really fast to me. I think they leaned way too hard into the latter and she came off like a child, which I guess was sort of the point, but that trope always rubbed me the wrong way. I prefer this to be done more like Vision, who seems intelligent and sophisticated but lacks the understanding of social cues or etiquette. Like he has knowledge, but he just doesn't know how to interact with people. I really don't like this take of a genius AI who spends the whole game going, huh? What? What's this do? I'm new here. Chief, do you know how babies are made? I don't know, this might be a personal preference, but I was not a fan of her character, and there's a twist with her later on that I obviously, again, won't spoil, but I genuinely can't tell if this was supposed to be a real twist for the audience, or if the audience was supposed to know this the whole time and she just didn't clock it until late in the game, but either way, it was super dumb. It was so obvious that either A, it's ridiculous for this to be a twist for us because from minute one I had already assumed this, or B, it's ridiculous for this to be a twist for her because I can't possibly believe this wasn't an immediate thought she had. I also don't like how the game uses her as a crutch to blatantly explain obvious themes or emotional beats in the story that don't need explanation.
You want to know who killed her. You need to know. She was important to you.
Very important.
especially because it sounds like the actress is speaking in a higher pitch than her normal voice to play this character, which is nothing against her, I'm sure she was just directed that way. But the whole game, she comes off like I do when I'm trying to order something from McDonald's and I'm trying to be polite, but I really just sound insufferable. Oh my god, I'm talking so much. I had no idea I had so many feelings about this game. The villains are also pretty terrible here. I guarantee I won't remember any of their names come the summer. Ask me in July what the villains' names were in Halo Infinite. The only answer I'll be able to come up with is the open world. Eshram has a bog standard look that has no staying power. He looks pretty lame, and his dialogue sounds like he's reading from the list of scary evil villains sayings handbook. I couldn't take him seriously this whole time, especially when he doesn't even come face to face with you until the end. He's just a hologram throughout the whole game. Master Chief was the only character I really liked in Halo Infinite. I always assumed that he was a lot like Doom Guy, like just a badass with no real personality outside of being a badass, which isn't a bad thing. I just thought that at most I was gonna get some one-liners out of him and that's it, but there's an actual character underneath all of that here. He's not deeply complex or anything, but there is a real person in there, and I'm glad he's more than just a symbol of badassery. That was a nice surprise as somebody who doesn't know a whole lot about him. But the issue is that because he's not super three-dimensional and he doesn't talk a whole lot and he's a bit one-track minded, you need characters around him to be doing a lot of the emotional heavy lifting, and like I said, they just kinda don't. A lot of which can be attributed to the fact that like 60% of the story is relegated to justifying boring busy work activities that barely feel like story missions. There's no space for interesting arcs or interactions when throughout most of your story, the only goal of what any character says is to get the player to go and blow something up somewhere. Literally every single objective in this game is go to this place or blow up this thing or leave this place. Deactivate the beam, locate the bridge, scuttle the ship, locate the weapon, follow the signal, clear the landing zone, head to the landing platform, follow the signal, find entry, disable regulators, take out the pylon, survive the attack, find the structure, defeat the hunter team, destroy the west gun, destroy the east gun, destroy the north gun, get the sequence data, get the sequence data, get the sequence data, get the sequence data. These are the real objectives. These aren't side quests. This is just how the game is, and every story beat feels like a way to justify why you're doing that. If you take the story on its own, it basically doesn't exist outside of the first half hour and the last few hours. And even when you look at that story, it's really telling that the most compelling parts of it are the flashbacks that explain what happened before this game happened. The game makes the thing that must have happened in between Halo 5 and Infinite, based on my very limited knowledge of that game, seem way more interesting than the stuff that happens here. And it's not just me who thinks this. I've seen Halo fans complain that this story is not nearly as substantial as past games, including someone in my own comments in my recent Halo poll. He mentioned how the villains felt incredibly flat and how the game was missing any legendary moments that made the previous games what they were, and while I haven't experienced the moments that he's referencing, I can absolutely agree that this game doesn't have any big moments that will stick with me for any significant period of time. It's crazy to me that a lot of the complaints that I've mentioned so far, not all of them, but a lot, are shared with a fair few people out there. A lot of people did not enjoy these exact same things. And yet, Halo Infinite's campaign, outside of the lack of co-op, was still super well received. It feels like these things were treated as minor issues and waved off, when really this is a humongous chunk of the game that falls flat. The entire story, level design, world, objectives, everything. I feel kinda crazy for having the take that I do because it's so different to everyone else's, but at the same time, I don't think I've said anything that people will entirely dismiss as non-issues, so what's the catch here? Well, simply put, the gameplay. People insist that as many shortcomings as the game has, its gameplay is so good that in the grand scheme of things, so many of these issues don't actually matter. Well, I have some thoughts on the gameplay. Halo Infinite's gameplay and I have a complicated relationship. While most people adore it, and in some cases it literally transforms the game from a dud to one of the best games of the year, it took a lot longer for me to warm up to this game's systems. And I think this is actually one of the biggest byproducts of my lack of experience with this franchise, so I'm gonna do my best to explain why I had a different attitude towards it right off the top here. Halo Infinite has its feet in two different generations. While on one hand it aims to be faithful to the original Halo trilogy that started it all, looking far more like Halo Combat Evolved in almost every way than it looks like Halo 5, it also wants to bring that formula to the modern day. You can slide and aim down sights, and most notably use a grappling hook in this game for traversal and as a major part of combat. That grappling hook thing was a typo that I read verbatim, but I'm keeping it in because that's kind of funny. For Halo fans, I think that creates an experience that feels like the game they love and understand and have an attachment to with modern FPS sensibilities. For a non-Halo fan, it felt more like a modern game that was being held back by a formula from 20 years ago. It's the same mix, but a different experience experience. Ultimately, I think it's better to have gameplay in place that appeases the fans over appeasing newcomers, so I'm not firing shots at the game for this. But this is a reality that's being a little bit overlooked since new players haven't been a major part of the online discourse. When the game has a grapple hook and de-emphasizes cover and encourages you to run out and face enemies head on, but it also has an insane lock-on from enemies that are 900 feet away, it doesn't have the fastest movement speed, and it doesn't have a double jump or a proper dash or anything, you kind of get mixed messages. I know some of that stuff is antithetical to the core Halo experience and people would hate it if it was there, but I'm just expressing how it felt to me. I've played tons of shooters that incorporate those more futuristic and fast-paced movement and combat mechanics, and in comparison to those, Halo Infinite feels like it's shackled to the past. Personally, I had a really hard time at first knowing how much I should try and use cover in this game. Occasionally at the beginning, I was just getting melted the second that I left safety, sometimes from really far away, and the kind of middle ground between the high-speed shooter and tactical shooter was a weird adjustment for me. And that was interesting because I'd played the multiplayer for at least a dozen hours at that point, and that felt natural. I honestly think the issue came with the levels being either too open for quick movement or too contained for a lot of movement period at the beginning. I'm not the best at shooters, clearly, but I've played a bunch. I can get through tough campaigns on higher difficulty levels. It's just that something about this game felt like it was lost in translation early on, and I actually got really frustrated. Eventually, I got the hang of it, and there were plenty of moments where I started getting really into the swing of things and understood what people were saying. I was using the grapple to launch into cover when I was getting absolutely railed. I was shooting upwards and pulling off headshots and using all of the unique weapons, some of which were duty, but a lot of which were viable and enjoyable to use. I was chucking explosives everywhere with the grapple hook, which was much better than the grenades because basically every enemy other than the Jackal and the Grunts rolled away from normal grenades. It definitely clicked eventually. But even when it did, I thought that the combat was really fun, but not to the point of righting the wrongs of the rest of the game. It still wasn't close to some of my other favorite shooters. It maybe gave you a couple more creative options at times, which was nice, but eventually you did a lot of the cool stuff and it turned into a solid shooter with a grapple hook. It took a while, but I did warm up to the combat eventually, but when I did enjoy it, it didn't keep me interested all the way through. It started getting really repetitive, mainly because the actual levels were so uninspired, so I felt like I was doing the same thing in the same places for 10 plus hours and then the credits rolled. Near the end, I was so tired of this combat, and keep in mind, I mainlined this whole game. I did not do a lot of the open world activities. And since you don't ever do anything else in this game aside from drive and shoot people, it devolved back into a vapid gameplay experience, which was a problem that the multiplayer didn't have to the same degree. The actual core of this gameplay is good, but with how repetitive the game around it was, I got tired of it really fast. Which was unfortunate for me around the end because the climax of this game is like 87 years long. It felt longer than the rest of the whole game. I swear to God, it just kept dragging and dragging, and at a certain point I started yelling at the screen to just end already. It doesn't help that stuff like the shield and dash are A, really bad, like this is not a satisfying or very helpful dash, nor is this a particularly useful shield, and B, appointed to the same slot as your grapple hook, so not only do you have to keep de-equipping and re-equipping these over and over if you want to use them, but when they're equipped, you lose access to the most fun part of this entire combat system, so I never wanted to do it, even for variety's sake. Like what, I'm gonna take away my ability to zip around, snap off shields, pull myself to enemies and create a shockwave, and toss explosives at people so I can put down this joke of a shield and nothing else? No thanks, this is dumb. Why go through the trouble of even taking a few seconds to equip this, use it, and go back to the grapple? It's not worth the time. The enemy AI in this game hard carries it in my opinion. If it wasn't as good as it was, I think I would have had a really bad experience. The enemies are intelligent and flank you and bum rush you, and they all have their own little quirks that you learn as the game goes along, which you can exploit faster and faster going forward. I hated that some of these enemies tracked you with the unwavering speed and accuracy of Joe from You. Seriously, take off your aim assist for God's sake. And it was a little bit annoying that some grenades felt like they were only useful against grunts and jackals because literally everything else got out of their way. But this is probably the best AI I've seen personally in a shooter like this, so these are minor complaints in the grand scheme of things. It also feels like the grunts had different writers than the rest of the game because they're like the funniest things on the planet. The writing in the main game isn't bad. I have problems with the story, but not quite as much with the dialogue, but this is like a 11 steps up. The little ways they make fun of you when they kill you, or the stuff they say when they're terrified, is just absolute gold. I have other minor complaints about this game, but honestly, I'm just gonna leave them. They don't make enough of an impact to make a fuss about, and I'm already feeling a little bit drained by all this negativity. I want to make it clear that if you like this game, or if you disagreed with anything I said, that's fine. Honestly, I really envy you. I would much rather enjoy a game than dislike it and rant about it for 20 minutes. This is not how I wanted this to go. And I don't want to act like people who enjoy this game are wrong, or that this game has no merits. A portion of why I felt the way I did definitely comes from the fact that this is my first Halo game, and it's got a weird half old, half new feel that feels more like a restriction to me on a modern gameplay loop than a cool addition to an old gameplay loop. So parts of this video were definitely circumstantial. If you liked it, I get it, and I'm genuinely happy for you. I wanted to like it too. But I didn't, and I think it might be good for more people to voice some of the more disappointing elements of this game, because when we go too lax on devs for mistakes that they made up for in different sections, it perpetuates the lazy game design that we're all so tired of. I'm obviously not saying go be mean to the devs, but we should definitely voice the problems and make it clear that they are problems that need to be addressed for the future of this franchise. The levels, the open world, the story, the characters, and not just have these major issues be swept under the rug. These are big problems. Anyways, sorry this video was such a downer. Hopefully the next one's a bit more positive. If you guys are new to the channel, consider subscribing. Look around the rest of the channel, see if there's anything you'd want to watch. Like the video if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next time. Peace.